channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be doing another ARK Survival Evolved creature. Last time around we did the jerboa, and that was from the Scorched Earth map, and I've had a lot of you guys request for me to do the rock drake from the Aberration map, so that's what we're going to do today. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so I'm going to start on the clay pieces first. We'll start with the head and then we'll move on to making the 4 feet. So I'm aiming to have this more of a medium style doll. I don't want it gigantic. Honestly, it'd be amazing if it was gigantic, but I kind of want to make something a little bit smaller. So I'm going to actually be doing quite a small head for the piece. I mean, the piece is still going to be kind of long and big, but I don't want it to be gigantic. So I'm going to take a lump of tinfoil, completely cover it in clay, make sure to smooth everything out, and then I'm going to start adding the details. So I'm going to start on the eyes as the first detail. Now I'm using these kind of grayish beads for the eyes, but if you want, I'd recommend kind of finding some yellow ones because the rock drake's eyes are actually yellow, and then you could just paint on the little pupil. I just didn't have yellow beads laying around, so I was using what I had available. So I'm going to get those placed, make sure they're nice and even, lay out the eyelids, and then start building up the face around the eyes. Usually once I have the eyes in place, I don't really plan on messing with them much more, so I'm going to start adding the details around it, like the wrinkles and different things like that, and as I slowly add more features, I'll add more texture to it. Next, I need to decide where my mouth is going to go. So I'm going to kind of roughly sketch out a line on both sides, make sure it's nice and even. Unless you want to make a weird expression, you want to make it even on both sides. Once you know that it looks nice the way it is, you can start cleaning up those lines and refining the shape. Now, a lot of my creatures I end up using strips of clay to make the lips more defined, but with this one, the lips aren't really like very pouty or anything, so I'm just going to kind of push in and sculpt with what I have available right now in the face. And then I'm going to add a little bit more clay to more of the jawbone and then kind of the back portion of the head, just because it's a little bit thicker right there and it needed to kind of stand out a bit more. Plus we needed a nice surface to start adding our spikes to, and I wanted to have them more lifted up than kind of flat against the head. And then the rock drake has these kind of crest shapes that frame the feather working that is on its face, so I'm going to lay those out. Now I'm going to make sure to have them thick enough so that they're not fragile, so the backing is going to be kind of thicker than it naturally would be, but we want to make sure that they don't just snap off or anything. So I'm going to lay those out and then start sculpting them. And the trick with these is to kind of sculpt them more on the outside to make them look kind of thin and fragile than to actually have them thin and fragile. And then the very top of the head, right between these two things that we just added, we're going to leave that nice and smooth and blank because we're going to be adding a lot of fake feathers and stuff like that, so there's no need to add any extra work for it. We're just going to leave it blank because it's going to get covered up anyways. After that's in place, I'm going to move on to adding the nostrils and then adding some scale texture around the lips. Okay, so I'm really liking how the head is looking right now. Everything is laid out really good, so what we're going to do is we're going to start laying out those spiky bits that are around the frame of the head. So we're just going to take balls of clay, roll them out into little spikes, and then we're just going to layer them. Kind of make a pattern if you want. You don't want to make it too messily. It looks like there's somewhat of a pattern to the rock drake's markings and stuff, so I'm going to try and make it look kind of nice and neat. So we're going to place these kind of above the back portion of the head and then kind of a little bit at the back of the jawbone. After I have all of the spikes laid out, I'm then going to use my tools to kind of clean up the edges and refine them, and then add a bit of a scale texture to blend them into the face. After that, I'm going to add texture to the rest of the face, and then I realized I needed to add the spikes at the very end of his chin, so I'm going to give him his little spiky soul patch, and then we are all done. So we're going to put the head in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 45 minutes. I don't think it'll need much longer than that. It's kind of small. Okay, so now we're going to start working on the feet. Now most of the feet are very similar, so I'm just going to show you the process of one, and then the little bit of difference that we're going to do on the back feet I'll go over real quick. So I have a kind of simple wire frame. It's a little bit more complex because I had to give him thumbs, so there's a little bit more wiring to it. And we're going to cover the portion where all the wires are combined, kind of more the palm of the foot. We're going to cover that in a lump of clay and blend everything together. And we're also going to add claws to the ends of all the wires. Once we have that in place, we're going to save our work in progress and we're going to put it in the oven for probably about 20 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Once that's out of the oven and it's cool to touch, we can start working on the bottoms of the feet. So what we're going to do with the bottoms is we're going to roll out a bunch of strips of clay, we're going to cover up all of our wire work and blend everything together. Now the bottom of the foot, if you want, you can add a bunch of texture and stuff to it, but you don't really need to because it's just something you don't see a lot, so you can kind of leave it plain. So I'm just going to get everything covered, blended, and then I'm going to put this in the oven again, 275 Fahrenheit for probably just another 20 minutes. Once that's out of the oven and it's cooled to touch again, we can start working on the tops of the feet. So I'm going to lay out some strips of clay. These ones are going to be kind of shorter and not covering the rest of the foot because I want to have the rest of the foot balls of clay and have it blended in better. So I'm just going to cover up about half of the toe with strips of clay and blend this into the clay that's already baked. Then I'm going to take some balls of clay. I'm going to start with larger ones for the very tips of the toes and then work my way to kind of smaller ones. And we're going to cover the rest of that top of the toe. And then I think I'm going to add some scales right at the knuckles, blend everything together, just clean them up, and then we're going to add a texture to the portion of the foot that's not scaled texture. So we're just going to kind of rough it up, and that's basically how we're going to make our front feet. And then the only difference between the front feet and the back feet is the back feet are going to have 4 toes, no thumb, and then we're going to also kind of build up the foot a little bit more. So we're kind of making a longer portion in the very top of the foot and just blend that into the rest of the foot. So it's just shaped slightly different. So we're going to put all of our finished feet in the oven for a final bake, which will be about 35-45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once everything is out of the oven and is cool to touch, we can start painting everything. Okay, so on to the painting. Now the main color that I want my rock drake to be is kind of a bluish green color for the body. The feathers I kind of want to be a reddish orange, and then his underbelly is going to be kind of a creamy color. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to primer the face the khaki color for the underside of the jaw. So I'm going to just do the whole thing, that way we can have some khaki undertones to the blues. So I'm going to get my head completely painted khaki, let it dry, and then we're going to start adding our blues to it. So I'm going to slowly add the blues to the spikes and different things, and I'm just brushing it on roughly. I'm going to define the shapes of everything a bit more later, but I kind of just want a basic color laid down of where I want the blues. After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take kind of a more metallic blue, and I'm going to go over those spikes on the back of the head and the back of the jaw. With the metallic paint, I'm going to be a bit more precise and start cleaning up my lines. And then I'm going to start darkening up different portions of the face with a darker blue, mainly the top of the face, more the front, and kind of his chin spikes. I'm going to darken up the base of the spikes just to kind of help separate them a little bit from the face. And then I'm going to take a really tiny brush with some black paint, and I'm going to go in between his lips to darken that crease. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of green to the face, and then I'm going to start working on those frills on the top of the head. So I'm just going to add some yellows and maybe some burnt oranges. And then since I had my yellow out, I decided to start painting the eyes as well. So I'm going to go over the eye, make sure to be very careful because of how tiny it is, it's easy to mess up. And then after the yellow has dried, I'm just going to add a little bit of a black dot for the pupil. And then finally, I'm going to add some white highlights to the rest of the face, clean it up, and then just let it dry. Now for the painting for the feet, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing that we did with the head, and we're going to primer it that khaki color. I'm mainly doing this because the under portion is going to be left khaki, and then we're going to kind of add our blues to the tops of the feet. So once that khaki has dried, I'm going to take my bigger brush and I'm going to lightly brush on some blue on the top of the foot, and then I'm going to use my smaller brushes to clean up and finish the scales. So the scales on the feet are going to be slightly darker, and I'm also going to go over them with that metallic paint that we used earlier. And then to help the blue on the foot just blend in a little bit more, plus to make it go better with the head, I'm going to add a slight bit of green to the tops of the feet. And then the claws are going to be a light gray. And then after that, I think the last thing I did was just add a little bit of a white highlight to the scales on the tops of the toes, and then I let everything dry. After my paint has dried, I'm going to mix up a batch of resin and I'm just going to paint over all the painting that we did with the resin. We're going to have to set this somewhere safe to dry. It's going to take roughly about 24 to 48 hours to completely cure, so while that's doing what it's doing, we can start working on the sewing for the body. Okay, so this is the pattern that I drew out to make the rock drake's body. I left it pretty simple. It's just a basic dragon shape. There's really not much to it other than when we add the feathers to the front legs later. I pretty much have the main body piece with the tail, and then the front legs, and then the back legs. And then I want the under portion of the body to be that khaki color along with the inside portion of the legs. So now I actually did this kind of in a harder way than I should have because I didn't have a lot of khaki fabric. What I should have done is use the khaki fabric as the backing and then sewn the sequins into place over that and just cut away the sequins where I didn't want it. But instead, I had a very small amount of it, so I cut the pieces that I needed to fit and I glued them onto the backing fabric that I normally use. I ended up layering my sequins over this and then sewing these layers together. After I did the sewing, I cut everything out and then I also cut the sequins off of the portion that had the khaki fabric. So again, I recommend doing it the more simpler way because this was a pain in the butt. Anyways, I got my sequence fabrics all finished and cut out and we're going to start sewing everything together. So I'm going to start with the sides of the body and we're going to sandwich these together and sew the belly closed. We're leaving the back of the dragon open for later. And then for the legs, I have the front legs and the back legs pinned together. I have the inside portion pinned to the outside portion, and we're just going to sew down the fronts of all of our legs with the sewing machine. Okay, so that's basically all the sewing we can do right now until we start putting everything together. Now we need to start working on the feathers. So for the feathers, I'm going to be using felt for this. Now I didn't cut them all out, but I did draw them out because I figured it'd be easier to paint them while they were all connected. It was a lot less messy this way. So I started with a orange colored felt, but this was a little bit too bright for what I was wanting, so I decided to kind of muddy it up a little bit. So what I did was I took some gray paint, I watered it down quite a bit, and then I painted over the felt. Now the felt absorbed quite a bit of it, so what I did to help it dry faster was I took some paper towels and I just kind of blotted it to absorb the water. Also, it looked a lot darker than I wanted as well, so it took out some of the paint too. So we're going to have to let this dry completely, and then what I did was I took kind of a lighter yellow color to kind of define the middle of the feathers. So I just brushed over slightly and blended it into the rest of the colors. This just kind of brightened up the middle of the feather, and then the next thing we need to do is we need to paint the tips of the feathers. The tips of the feathers are kind of a more metallic color, so I'm going to use my metallic paints. So I'm going to start with a blue. I'm going to go over the tips of all the feathers, let that dry, and then go over this again with a bit of a purple. That way we can have that fade from blue to purple. So for all the larger feathers, I painted the very tips, but what I did for the feathers that are going to go on the head is I just painted some dots on it. So each feather, I'm just painting 2 blue dots. I let that dry, and then for the purple portion, I decided I wanted to add a little bit more texture to it, so I decided to use my purple 3D fabric paint. So I just put a little bit of a purple dot in between the blue dot. Now right now I really like how they look, but they need to have a bit more texture, so I decided to get my fabric markers and draw some lines on the sides of the feathers. So I'm just going to go over, I think I went over with kind of a yellowy color and it didn't show up very well, and then I decided to go over with a gray. And then lastly, for the feathers for the wings, I decided to do the very middle portion of the wing with my 3D paint as well to make it stand out. So I decided to use a light blue and I just went down the middle. Now this did dry a little darker than I wanted, but it looks perfectly fine. So I had to let all the feathers completely dry, and then once they were dried, I could cut them all apart. Okay, so we basically have all the components to put our rock drake together. We have the clay pieces, the fabric, the feathers. So I have a very simple wire frame and we're going to start putting everything on it. So I'm going to start with the fabric for the body. I cut some holes for the wires for the legs and I'm going to slide it over the wire frame. Then I'm going to take the clay head and I'm going to glue this to the wire for the neck. We're going to let that dry just a little bit, that way it's not falling off of the wire, and then we're going to take the fabric for the neck and start gluing it around the base of the head. Now for the back of our rock drake, he has feathers going all the way down, so these ones are kind of finer than the other ones, so what I decided to do was use fur fabric for this. So I took a strip of kind of like reddish orange fur fabric and I glued it to the very top of the head. Now this is measured out to the length of the body, and what we're going to do is we're going to sew all the way down the body, closing everything up and stuffing it. So we're going to get our body completely closed up, and then I'm going to take my hair trimmer to kind of clean up the fur a little bit so it's not so fluffy. I don't want it this fluffy, it's a little too long, so I'm just going to kind of go over it a bit. Now that the body is put all together, I left the very end of the tail open, and what we're going to do is we're going to add those feathers to the ends of it. So I took a very tiny piece of cut fur fabric and I'm going to glue my tail feathers to this. We're going to kind of have them layered a little bit, and we're just going to make sure they're nice and even, and then we're going to also put a little bit of fur fabric on the top of this and let it dry. After it's dried, we can glue this to the end of our tail. Now for adding the legs, I'm going to start with the back legs first because the front legs have all those feathers and I don't want them in the way while working on the back leg. So I figured this would be a lot easier. So I'm going to take the fabric for the back leg and I'm going to lay it out where I want the leg to go, kind of surrounding that little wire for the leg. So I'm going to sew the under portion first, and then I'm going to sew more of the hip portion over this. After we have the fabric for the leg in place, we're going to adjust the length of our wire for the leg because I left them a little bit longer just in case. We're going to make sure that they're the correct length, and then we're going to add our foot to the end of this. So the wires that are hanging out of the back of our clay foot, we're going to wrap onto the wire frame. So I'm going to be using a 20 gauge wire, and we're just going to wrap everything together and make sure it's nice and secure. After the clay legs are in place on the wire frame, we can then take the fabric for the leg and glue it around the base of the foot. We're going to let that dry a little bit, and then we can stuff and close up the back of the back legs. And then for the front legs, we're basically doing the same thing. I'm going to sew the under portion first, more of the shoulder blade next. We're going to make sure it's surrounding the wire, add the clay foot to the wire for the legs, and then we're going to glue the fabric for the leg around the base of the foot. Let that dry, stuff, and then when we're closing everything up, we're going to be sewing our feathers in place. So I'm going to start at the wrist, and as I'm sewing, I'm adding my feathers into place. So I'm going to make sure to have my feathers laid out in a pattern where I can easily keep track of where they go, and I'm just going to close up the foot, stuff it, and add the feathers at the same time. So it's a little time consuming for this. After we have the front legs done, we're going to take those feathers for the head and we're going to start gluing them in place. We can also use a little bit of cut fur fabric to cover up some seams if we need to. So I'm just going to be layering these in place, making sure that they kind of have a nice pattern to them, and then we're going to let that dry. Okay, so I really like how his body looks. It looks very proportionate to how he looks in the game. I'm really excited. So now we just need to adjust his sequence and start painting his body a bit. So I'm going to start with his underbelly. It's just a little bit too creamy. I want to add a bit of like yellows to it and darken it up a bit. So we're going to kind of muddy up his belly and his underarms and stuff like that, and then we'll move on to the sides of his body. With the sides of the body, I'm going to kind of use more lighter blues. The main thing that I want to do with this is have the blue fade into the khaki color a little bit more easily. So for this painting, I'm really just adjusting it here and there, kind of brightening up different spots and darkening others, throwing in a little bit more green to the body since his clay pieces have a bit of green, and then I'm kind of dirtying up the fur fabric going down the back of him because it's just a little too bright as well. guys, and that's how I made a rock drake from ARK Survival Evolved. I had so much fun with this project. I love how his body came out. I'm kind of debating on keeping the pattern and using it in one of my own creature designs just because I like how it's proportioned, and I think it could be fun to throw on a pair of wings with that type of body style. Anyways, I'm going to have him along with a bunch of other creatures in my Etsy shop, so if you guys want to buy anything, check the links down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!